Okay. So getting going here, overview of our agenda. Again, I'm going to do a recap of our drought declaration process and implications and where we are now here at fall of 24 with implications for our upcoming and new current water year 25. And then we're going to have a new guest today before we go into our regular presenter committee members. Ecology's rule lead, Danielle Gallatin, is going to present on our rulemaking process to update Ecology's permanent drought rule and upcoming engagement opportunities to participate. And then we'll jump to Karen with the Office of the Washington State Climatologist on her regional climate settings, and then Nick with USGS on stream flow and groundwater, Chris with Borough Reclamation on Yakima, and Amy with Northwest River Forecast Center for water supply forecasts, and then time for discussion. I will also note that Matt from NRCS is on leave this week, but if there's time at the end, I do have a couple of slides that he shared with me if there's anything additional to cover that folks haven't already covered. And again, our committee here provides an important role to Ecology to advise on current and forecasted water supply conditions, and when we're approaching a potential drought declaration, whether a hydrologic drought threshold has been met, and I will touch on that in just a moment. And for our meeting here in October, again, as we're in the early point of water year 25, share on water conditions we're seeing early on, as well as for today's meeting, share about Ecology's process to update our permanent drought rule. And again, to recap, our emergency drought declaration is still in place. And back in April, we declared an essentially statewide drought due to low snowpack and a warm and dry forecast. While many basins in Washington are snowpack dependent, there were still some concerns we saw for rain dependent basins. And again, the exception for the Puget Sound metro area was specifically for the areas served by the utilities of Everett, Seattle, and Tacoma, due to the fact that with their reservoirs, they managed earlier on this year for drought conditions. That was an active management. And when we talk about drought here in Washington state, we specifically mean two thick conditions have been met and have to be met for us to go through our drought declaration process. The first is a hydrologic threshold that an area is receiving or is projected to receive less than 75% of a normal water supply. And by normal, I'm referring to the average of the last 30 years, which right now is from 1991 to 2020. And then a hardship threshold, which means that water users and the environment are expected to experience undue hardship. And again, this committee advises on that hydrologic threshold. And when we talk about water supply, there's not one way that we determine water supply or one factor we look at. There's a range of different factors that we look at. That includes snowpack, precipitation, temperature, soil moisture, and the forecasts for all of those. And again, we were looking at a range of these different factors and different ways to look at them when this hydrologic threshold was met back in April. And in terms of the conditions we've now seen throughout summer and into early fall, there were some hardship and drought impact conditions we expected, and we've seen many of those come true. But again, as we've heard from folks on this committee, and we'll likely hear more, there were moments throughout the summer when impacts could have been a lot worse as if things hadn't gone slightly differently. For agriculture impacts, we definitely saw fallow land, particularly in the Yakima Basin and other parts of central Washington, but also in places in the Dungeness Basin over on the Olympic Peninsula. And for in-stream flow and fish impacts to fish passage, concerns for fish mortality. And again, when we see these lower flows, that is impacts on temperature, which we all know salmon like cold water here. And again, for public water systems and domestic uses, in these drought years, we still have small water systems that are dependent on surface water streams. When those surface water streams dry up earlier in a drought year, that creates cause for concern. But sometimes those impacts are not seen until later in the year or early fall. But like this year, that little bit of rain we got in August made a big difference. And with the implications of a drought declaration, that means two main things. Ecology can expedite the processing of water transfer and drought well permit applications, but all the requirements of those applications, including mitigation, are still in place. And then second, that we can open up drought response grant funding to assist public entities in addressing the drought impacts they're experiencing from this current drought. And those grants are eligible for these list of public entities, including tribes, cities, counties, utilities, and irrigation and conservation districts. And of course, that also means that for the state government, we can use drought response funds for interagency agreements for ways that other state agencies are uniquely positioned to respond to drought. And also opens up eligibility for federal funding for different public entities and really helps to share the message about changing drought conditions currently and long-term in Washington. And these grants are still open for folks that are seeing concerns at this point in time stemming from current water supply concerns from water year 24. And as I'm wrapping up here, I want to highlight some example projects. This includes leasing of water, which we've seen projects for in grants this year, as well as transportation for emergency water supplies, and we had a grant for that last year. And for fisheries, that include eliminating migration barriers, where sometimes during a drought year, people will recreationally move rocks to make places to swim or hang out, but that is not great for fish passage. And a couple of other pieces to highlight here for drought management. Currently, for drought response to make funds available, we issue an emergency rule to go along with our drought response guidance. However, emergency rules can only be out for 120 days at a time. So we reissued that in mid-August, and then that's currently going through December 12th. And depending on conditions, we may reissue that again to go along with the drought declaration. And that drought declaration is still in place until April of 25. And we will be evaluating conditions throughout this fall and winter. And if it seems like we've made a great recovery, particularly in snowpack, then we may evaluate rescinding that earlier. We will be looking to see clear evidence of recovery in terms of water supply conditions in snowpack, particularly after the snowpack drought we had this year that had the impacts we saw on water supply and different magnitudes across the state. And so with that, I'm going to pass it off to Danielle to share her slides and talk about our process to update our permanent drought rule.
There we go. There's the audio. Awesome. Thank you, Caroline. All right, let me get my presentation prepped up here. Caroline, I am prevented from sharing my screen.
Fix that one moment. Sorry about that.
No worries.
Okay, all set.
Okay. All righty. Are you able to see that okay? Wonderful. Thank you. All right. Well, good morning, everybody. As Caroline mentioned, my name is Danielle Gallatin, and I am the Water Resources Rural Development Lead. And thanks for allowing me some time to come chat with you today about our amendment to the rule and some of our opportunities to provide input and inform draft rule language. So in summary, this morning I'll be going over a quick rundown of why we are here today, and I'll also go over what the current rule states and where there are opportunities to update language. And then I'll briefly go over our timeline for this rulemaking, and I will skip over the when and why we declared drought because Caroline just went over that and explained that. I'll then go over the goals for this rulemaking and talk about how we will be using input through our survey questions. And lastly, I will talk about how to stay connected and informed during this rulemaking process. Alrighty, so to orient us on where we are today, Ecology is amending the emergency drought relief rule. And some of our goals include streamlining grant funding availability with a drought declaration and exploring where we can also provide clarity on process and terms. And of course, we want to make this rule update the most useful and meaningful for folks. And to do that, we recognize that people across the state experience drought impacts in different ways. And we want to hear from everybody and get a really broad understanding of how drought is impacting different folks throughout the state. All right, now let's look a little bit more at what the current existing rule states and where there are opportunities for some clarification. So this is a very simplified overview of the existing rule language, which describes our drought declaration process, and it also describes how we manage certain drought relief activities. And during this rule update, we are considering different ways we can provide clarity on that existing language and procedures. And we're also exploring topics such as grant funding administration and grant criteria for drought relief activities, and clarifying the roles of different state agencies when it comes to providing drought relief. And then we also have terms such as undue hardship that we could provide some clarification on. And when we're conducting rulemaking or rule amendments, it's important to note that there are limitations to what we can amend. And there are some elements of the current language that are written in statute that can't change, but I'll go over some examples of that in just a minute. But just kind of in short, we want this rule update to provide some predictable and streamlined access to resources when our state declares a drought emergency. And as Caroline mentioned, right now we do have to go through that emergency rulemaking to make funds available. And part of the intent of this rule is to kind of incorporate that language so that funds are available as soon as there's a drought declaration and we don't have to go through that emergency rulemaking once or twice a year. All righty, so let's look at the timeline that we're aiming for with this rulemaking. So just taking us back a little bit, Ecology announced the intent to amend this rule back in November of 2023. And we're now moving forward with the outreach and engagement phase of this rulemaking process, which leads us to where we are today with seeking input before drafting rule language. And our survey questions kind of will help guide some of the information that we receive that will inform draft rule language. And I'll go over those survey questions at the end, towards the end here. And then in the fall of 2025, we will develop proposed draft rule language that will then be open for public comment. And our goal is to have this rule adopted around February of 2026, and in time to be useful for our 2026 drought declaration if we have conditions that trigger us to go through that declaration process. All right, the when and why do we declare drought, we can just kind of skim over because Caroline mentioned both that hydrologic threshold and that hardship threshold. And just kind of mirroring a little bit what Caroline said on, why do we go through the drought declaration process? And, first it legally allows Ecology to provide resources for drought relief. And again, as Caroline mentioned, although the same processes and paperwork are required, we are able to expedite a lot of those administrative and timing hurdles so that things such as those drought-related permits and temporary transferring of water rights can just happen on a faster timeline. And just as importantly, it provides those funds to public entities for drought impacts. And same entities that Caroline mentioned earlier. And some of our goals for this rulemaking, again, just include exploring language that would streamline administration of emergency drought relief resources. And we also want to look at language and terms that could be clarified just to make more sense to the average reader. And of course, we want to do all of this rulemaking process in an equitable way under the law. Given that, though, there are some limitations to what language can be updated and included with this rule amendment. And there is language and direction that's given in statute that can't change with this rulemaking. And some examples of those things include like the legal process for how we do a drought declaration. And of course, we must maintain existing water rights and things such as like who is eligible for the grants and some of those cost share requirements are just some of the things and examples of where we don't have flexibility to make changes. But where we can make improvements and updates to this language, we want to make sure we're doing that thoughtfully and intentionally. And a really big part of making updates that are useful for people includes hearing from people and getting their input around drought relief. And with that, just wanted to let you know that responses to our survey questions will, of course, be documented. And we do plan on providing a 1 or 2 page follow-up on responses and common themes that we hear throughout this engagement phase. Before I do bring up the survey questions, and I'll go through them briefly together. And there are only 6 questions, so won't take too much time. I will take some questions on the content of this presentation. I'll also provide information and links on how to stay connected during this rulemaking. And as soon as I stop presenting, I'll also put all those links in the chat so you have easy access to them and can copy them. And please share with anyone you think may be interested far and wide. We want to reach as many people as we can. And our survey questions will be open and available to answer via the SurveyMonkey link anytime between now and November 22nd at midnight. And please, yes, share this link. There is no requirement to have listened to this presentation to fill out the survey and give us your input. All right, before I dive into those survey questions and throw those links up here, do we have any questions on the content of this presentation? And if I'm not seeing something pop up in the chat, Caroline, please let me know.
Oh, I don't see anything, Danielle. I don't see any hands. So I'd say keep going for now. If any questions come at the end, I can always answer those.
Perfect. That sounds good. And I'll also put my email up. So if you think of something later or have a question, feel free to email me directly. I'll be happy to talk with you. Okay, so these are our survey questions. Again, there are 6, and I'll just read through them and provide a couple examples. And these examples are just to get your brain juices flowing and thinking about some of the answers, but are in no way intended to limit or confine the information you provide. Alrighty, so question number 1, how have you experienced impacts from drought, and how do you anticipate future impacts from drought in a changing climate? And again, just some examples to get you thinking. Like perhaps it's the timeline for which you make decisions on like which crops to grow, or if you're going to be fallowing your field, or municipalities perhaps prohibiting residential yard watering, or of course our hatcheries operators, maybe there is some timing issues with fish hatchery releases. And question number 2, what factors do you consider when determining the level of drought impacts to plan for within a drought year? And when do you start planning for potential drought impacts? And again, just some examples, like do you monitor the snow level or reference farmers' almanacs, or wait for the state to declare drought, or just kind of what are some of the factors and things that you look at? Question number 3, are there equity considerations you would want to be included in drought relief funding decisions? And this is just left broadly open because there are all sorts of ways to answer this question, and we want to hear all of those. Question number 4, what are barriers to accessing emergency drought relief during a declared drought emergency? These could be barriers that you experience yourself, or your agency or group experiences, or just things that you have witnessed and seen out in the environment during drought times. And question number 5, are there improvements you'd like to see to the administration of grant funds? Of course, noting a drought response project must address impacts for a currently declared drought, and these funds are limited to drought impacts. There is a different funding source for drought preparedness and planning. And then last but not least, are there any other considerations for emergency drought relief you would like us to consider for this rulemaking? And this is just to capture, perhaps there is a question here that we didn't think to answer that you would want us to consider and know about. So this is just meant to kind of capture that information. And how to stay connected. You can sign up for our email list. We will be sending updates along the way. You can check out our webpage here. We also make sure we keep our updates to what we're doing with this rulemaking there. And here is both a link and a QR code for our survey. Please take that and share. And then last is my email address. So if you wanted to reach out to me directly, and I will put all these in the chat as well, so you don't have to rush and copy them down.
Hey, and
But
Danielle, since this is a statewide group, can you also
yes,
share about the listening sessions virtually and in person that are coming up?
yes, absolutely. And I will put a link to that in the chat as well. Thanks for that reminder, Caroline. So there are two listening sessions happening. There is one on October 20, I think we decided on the 24th, and then one on the 30th. Um,
And
and
Danielle, can you also highlight the in-person ones because people may live in those places as well?
Oh, exactly. Yes. So we're having three in-person just open houses for we're inviting folks to just come and chat with us, and the same information will be presented. There is one on the 14th, and that will be actually, sorry, the 14th is when we're heading out, but it will be the 15th in Twisp at the community center there, and there will be one in Yakima at the Washington Fruit Center, and that will be from 4 to 6. So definitely come and see us, and I'll put links to all of that in the chat as well, so you don't have to just memorize that. You can go ahead and check that link, and that will have all the details, and it will also have links to the addresses for the locations. Oh, and last but not least, there's also one in October 22nd in Tacoma on the other side of the state, and that will be at the Tacoma Community College, and that will be from 4 to 6.
Great, thanks, Danielle.
All righty,
Any
thank you,
quick
everybody.
process questions? All right, great, thanks. Yeah, Danielle, if you could put all of those informations into the chat, that would be great.
Absolutely,
And
I will do that right now.
great. And with that, we'll pass it over to Karen.
Great, good morning. Heather, are you going to share or should I?
I got you covered. Just one
Okay.
second. Okay, let's see how we do today. Can we see it?
Yes. Oh, yep. Perfect.
Yay.
Great. So good morning, everyone. Thanks, Danielle, for that information, by the way. Really interesting stuff. I'm excited to look at that survey more. And I'm Karen Bumbacco. I'm from the Office of the Washington State Climatologist, and we'll be giving a little bit of an update on our current conditions where we're sitting right now. Go ahead to the next slide, please. All right, so water year 2024 is complete. Happy new water year. The temperature anomaly is on the left-hand side. Our precipitation percent of normal is on the right-hand side. Overall, the water year was on the warm side, warmer than normal. Most locations between 1 and 3 degrees Fahrenheit above normal for the 12 months from October to September, and then precipitation near normal in parts of Western Washington, some other parts in sort of Southern Washington, and but overall a little bit on the dry side. So a note about these numbers, the National Center for Environmental Information is located in Asheville, North Carolina. They are our data record holders. Obviously, they've been devastated by the hurricane that moved through there. Their website is down, so I was unable to get any of the sort of the ranking information that I usually show for temperature and precipitation. I did want to know all the staff is safe and accounted for, which is a relief. All the paper data records are safe and fine. In fact, I had visited there probably 10 years ago now, and they had talked about a previous flood and how they had realized they could not leave all those records in the basement of the building. So that's all good. But it will take some time for their data servers to get back up. So this 1.3 degrees Fahrenheit above normal for the water year is an estimate we did based on the data shown in this map. For reference, October through August ranked as the 11th warmest in the 130-year record. So I don't expect the ranking to have changed drastically with the addition of one extra month. So still pretty warm relative to a lot of the historical years. Precipitation, very similar to what it was through August at about 90% of normal average for the state. The ranking is not as anomalous as temperatures were. October through August ranked as like the 47th driest out of the 130 years. So on the drier side, but not that anomalous. Go ahead to the next slide, please. So looking at just September, I was scratching my head looking at this precipitation map because located in Western Washington, it seemed like it rained. And of course it did, but it just didn't rain as much as we normally should see rain in September. There's some near normal areas, some parts of the northern Puget Sound, the San Juan Islands, slightly above normal precipitation for September, near normal in the southern Puget Sound region. But overall, very dry throughout most of the state, especially eastern Washington, less than 30% of normal for that huge area of that kind of dark brown color. Temperatures on the left-hand side were much warmer than normal for the month too, again, especially east of the Cascade Crest. So these numbers are the same estimate using the data shown in the map there. So about 3.2 degrees Fahrenheit above normal average for the whole state. And then even though we did see some normal precipitation on the west side, because we saw very little elsewhere in the state, it was averaged at about 43% of normal for September. Next slide, please. So because I couldn't get that the statewide numbers, I went ahead and pulled just a few point locations for some long-term weather stations that have existed in those areas, just to get a sense for where this ranks compared to other Septembers. And really for a lot of these Eastern Washington locations, it was quite warm in September compared to the historical records. So for Wenatchee, Omak, Yakima, Pullman, all tied or either tied or were the warmest September on record. Spokane has a really long record going back to 1881, and it was the second warmest September. So I pulled the anomalies there sort of in that middle column, looking between 4 and 5.5 degrees above normal for the month. I also looked at the precipitation rankings, and that sort of varied. Tied for the driest in Wenatchee, 5th driest in Omak, 17th driest in Yakima. I mean, this is a time of year we're not expecting a ton of precipitation east of the crest anyway, so there have been other years that were as dry. But I did want to point out Pullman, and there was sort of the southeastern corner of the state did receive September precipitation, so they were actually the opposite and were more on the wetter side compared to their long record, about 16th wettest there. Next slide, please. So just looking at the very first week of water year 2025, hardly any data has happened yet, but slightly cooler in our temperatures for the first week of October. Precipitation still below normal. If you add a few more days to this plot on the right-hand side, you might see a little bit of green in Western Washington where it's currently white, but still less precipitation than we normally see. So I'm looking forward to hear Nick's talk on how this has affected our stream flow. Next slide, please. So this is the drought monitor map on the left-hand side. As a reminder, this is different than, of course, what the state declares as drought, different definitions. This is a weekly map that changes weekly. And then on the right-hand side is the change map. So this is showing what has changed in the drought monitor since our last meeting. So over the last 5 weeks or so, really not a ton of change there. Before our last meeting, there had been a lot of improvement in Western Washington from that August rain, just a slight improvement since then, and then some worsening in Eastern Washington. And really, we haven't seen a lot of drought improvement. Next slide, please. Moving into the Central Tropical Pacific, these are sea surface temperature anomalies, and we can start to see some blue colors along the equator there in the Pacific, representing El Nino that is emerging soon. Conditions are still currently neutral. Next slide, please. And the probability that a La Nina will show up has actually increased a little bit since our last meeting of the WASAC committee. Still expected to emerge relatively soon, so sometime in the 3-month September to November period. And when I talk about the probabilities being a little bit higher, those blue bars on the left-hand side are just slightly higher than they were last time we met. So feeling more confident that it will be La Nina compared to neutral conditions for this winter. So those probabilities are above 80% for parts of the fall and winter. And then the other difference is the probability of an El Nino is essentially nothing. That has decreased as well for the projections. And then on the right-hand side, that shows all the different models showing how strong the event will be. And it's still looking like might be a weak La Nina event. We can still see weather impacts, even if it's a weak La Nina. But the chances of a really moderate to strong La Nina event are less than 50%. Next slide, please. So we haven't had a big change since we last met. The Climate Prediction Center's official outlook that takes into account the La Nina, the seasonal climate models, historical data, the trends. They're still showing pretty much equal chances for October, November, December temperatures. So unsure whether it will be below normal, near normal, or above for Washington State, and a higher probability of above normal precipitation for October, November, December. Some of the National Weather Service colleagues on the call will be able to speak to this better than I can, but it does look like we'll see some wetter conditions over the next couple of weeks here in October. So we have some time, 3 weeks left, obviously, to make it a wetter month, even though we've started off pretty dry. Next slide, please. And I should say, I brought that up about October because the October monthly outlook is also saying above normal precipitation, or actually, I don't think it is. Sorry, I take that back. The previous slide was October, November, December. So there's clearly more time than 3 weeks for it to be a wet period since it's for 3 months. Okay, sorry for that confusing diversion. Looking at January through March, this was also the same as our last meeting, still looking like a higher likelihood of below normal temperatures for January, February, March for our state and above normal precipitation. I still feel less confident about that below normal temperature forecast. Some of the multi-model ensembles are showing more near normal temperatures during January to March. So I think this is hanging the hat a little bit more on La Nina than I'm personally comfortable for. However, since our last meeting, there's a lot better consistency among different forecast products for wetter than normal January through March, and that's what the CPC is showing here. Next slide, please. So I wanted to transition a little bit and just make a pitch for the Oregon and Washington Water Year meeting that is coming up at the end of the month. It is virtual and it's 2 mornings. So it goes from about 9 to noon on the 29th of October and the 30th of October. And if you haven't been involved in this meeting in the past, we recap the weather and climate of the water year. Although I have to admit, I'm a little nervous that NCEI is not going to have their data servers back up. It's just such a huge impact from that hurricane, but I guess all that's out of my hands, and we'll still be able to provide a good review of the water year. But the other part of the meeting, and is my favorite part, is reviewing the sector-specific impacts. It's for Washington and Oregon, so not just Washington focused, but to entice you to attend, our WASAC's very own Amy Burke is going to be giving a presentation about how the water year 2024 stream flow forecasts did in our area. The new state climatologist, Guillaume Auger, he's going to be doing the recap of the water year. And then I'm also really excited for this talk. Michael Garrity from the Department of Fish and Wildlife in Washington is going to be talking about the Resilient Columbia Basin Initiative, which is an agreement to remove some dams on the Snake River and just kind of talk about what's all involved in that. And I think that'll be of interest to the group. So I can put this link. Oh, it looks like Caroline already did. Thank you. In the chat to register. You do have to register. It's free, but it's just so you get the Zoom link to attend. Next slide, please. And then I also, we're talking about a lot of surveys today, but a part of this meeting, a part of the water year meeting, a product that comes out of that is the Pacific Northwest Water Year Impacts Assessment. So this includes Idaho too. So it's Washington, Oregon, Idaho. And we have written 4 already. And it recaps the water year. And then it has like different sectors where it explains what the impacts were for the water year. We get that information from many different ways, but the main source is this survey that's been released. So it's the Pacific Northwest Water Year Impact Survey. This year it's a little different. It's in Qualtrics, and we found a way to make it required that you enter like a general location for what the impact is. So I'm really excited about what the results will be. So this survey is going to be open until November 27th, so just that Wednesday before Thanksgiving. And unlike what Danielle was talking about general, like how can we be better prepared for drought, this is very specific to the 2024 water year. So even if it wasn't a drought impact, if it was like a flooding impact or something from, high temperature impact, like we would love to hear about it and include it in this report. Next slide, please. All right, so water year 2024 was officially warmer than normal for the entire state, drier than normal for a majority of the state. September precipitation was really quite minimal across eastern Washington, and we had above normal temperatures statewide that ranked amongst the top 1 or 2 in the historical record for some of those locations in eastern Washington. I was initially really excited by that mid-August rain, but I would say this fall rain has really not been consistent enough to claim any drought recovery or that our fall onset of rain has started. I would like to see a little higher stream flows and a better response to that fall rain yet to claim that. And then a weak La Nina is likely to develop by late fall still, and we have higher chances of above normal fall and winter precipitation, which is good news, but those temperatures during the fall and winter are more uncertain. And I'll leave it at that.
Great. Thank you very much, Karen. Any quick questions for Karen? And I will just note briefly that in November, Karen's going to do more of a deep dive into La Nina and what that might mean for 24. So I'm excited for that, Karen. And with that, we'll pass it off to Nick with USGS.
Hello, good morning, everyone. I just want to mention, I apologize for my voice or anything. I've been feeling a bit under the weather. So I'll try to mute if I have to cough or anything. All right, yeah, just to recap here of stream flow and groundwater conditions at USGS gauging stations in Washington. I'm starting as usual with the 7-day average stream flow as of now. You can see that we're primarily below normal conditions at most of our stream gauges. There's a large number of green stations, which indicate normal, but certainly a large number of the orange and deep red, which are below normal conditions. We take a closer look at the 8 index gauging stations that we normally look at that have near natural stream flow conditions as an indicator of natural flow without too much influence from water management. We see that trend, as I had mentioned before, really jumping out here below normal at every one of these gauges except Puyallup near Orting, which is much below normal conditions. And if we look at the duration hydrograph for those 7-day averages, starting from kind of back toward the beginning of the year, taking us to the end of the water year here. We have a little interruption here. You might notice, you'll see it in a couple of other plots. Water Watch, which is where I get these some of these plots from. It was down for a while, and I'm not sure exactly what the conditions were with that. We have kind of some missing estimates here in the time, but the take-home message being that as we were riding through the end of the summer in below normal conditions, we're now kind of the much below normal range across the state. And so here again is that missing gap that I had mentioned. Now we're backing up to look at the last 45 days, again with the 7-day average stream flow conditions. This 50 line, this vertical axis representing the percentage of our USGS stream gauges. We usually look at this 50% line to see if most of our gauges are flowing about normal, which they were through the end of the summer there as we kind of came into the fall, but now we're kind of on the borderline of below normal conditions. And again, this is just the number of, or these are the stream gauges just at each of these gauges. Similar data in this plot on the right here showing the average stream flow index, where this red line could either be above normal or below normal. Currently, we're below normal, kind of getting closer and dropping down even further than we were prior. Now, if we look at the cumulative runoff hydrograph, I have here on the right is this year, on the left 2023 as labeled. As we're finishing up the water year, we had ended in normal conditions for 7-day average stream flow, and this was just the cumulative runoff, so that throughout the entire water year. Excuse me. So as opposed to just looking at 7-day averages, and now we're looking at the area based stream flow across HUCs in the state, also for the 7-day averages, but now rather than just numbers of stream gauges, looking at spatially, we can see a similar trend where we have below normal and much below normal conditions. We still have record lows over here, and as we've seen for the last couple of times we met over in the Upper Columbia and the Roosevelt Basin. And just kind of panning back to and I should say, this is just for October so far, the last 7 days in October. And now we can take a step back to look at the last 2 times we did meet, seeing that trend where we kind of have gotten a bit drier even from August to September into October. And again, this is just relative to our percentiles, the normal flow conditions. And if we again compare now September, since that was a complete month as we finished out the water year, down here in the lower right, compare that to the 4 of the more significant droughts we've had in recent years, as we usually do. We can see that we have, I guess, similar trends as far as some of these much below normal basins here in the central part of the state. And not as bad, I guess, as 2001, and certainly drier than 2019. The next slide I have here is because I was just curious. So looking at the years prior, since we're looking at September, the years prior going into the drought years. So this is 01, 05, 15, and 19. If we look at 2000, 2004, 2014, 2018, thinking about this next coming year, some of those Septembers, all these were pretty wet, and the Septembers preceding drought years. And we look a bit drier than most of those, particularly except for 2018 going into the 2019 drought. So hopefully La Nina does kick up and give us a little bit of moisture to help rise this duration hydrograph and our cumulative hydrograph off to a good start. So I showed this before. where we're in much below normal conditions, showing each of these shows 2 years. So we can kind of get the water year right in the middle of these calendar years. This capturing the 2023. This is just one's a continuation of the other. But if we about 2023, we were riding much below normal for a significant period of time following May all the way into September. We were just not quite as bad this year. We were in below normal conditions and have kind of dipped into much below normal a couple of times, including presently. Also looking back then, 2022, where we were in much wetter conditions during that kind of decline in the late or throughout the summer and then into the fall. And then again, comparing this to these drought years, that's what usually what I'm looking at here then is just looking at our stream flow as we come down at the end of the summer and into the fall. Some of these being similar to kind of where we're at, but certainly some of them being much worse, being much below normal conditions. But again, I think it's a fresh year, a fresh new water year. So hopefully we can try to make up for some of that deficit. I've also show here then this percentage of stream gauges that I showed before that are flowing at within different percentile ranges in the state. And this goes back to 2001 to present. I've indicated the location for some of those past droughts we normally look at. So some of these, certainly 2001, 2005, most of our stream gauges, and 15, they were a lot drier than 19 and 2024. So not quite as bad, at least in the places that we're recording stream flow. Now to step into the groundwater conditions. Again, I just keeping this up here at least for a few months in case folks tune in and weren't aware that the Scatter Creek well was discontinued. So we're no longer collecting data there and we're no longer publishing that data online. So I don't cover the conditions at that well anymore, but I'll cover these other two, Davenport and the eastern central part of the state. Showing here the thick blue line, current conditions, depth to water at that well. This dashed line is the median, this tan line here being last year. So we are currently in better conditions than last year, more water in that well, but quite a bit below median conditions at this well. And now we'll pan out looking at a number of years here, almost a decade, looking at recharge kind of cycles at the Davenport. I usually back up this far just to show kind of this low point when where we kind of had a period of much wetter conditions at this well for a number of years, and we've come back down and we've kind of maybe started to make another climb. So hopefully we can keep that momentum and maybe have another increase in kind of a build in wet conditions there at that well. Now moving to the southeastern part of the state, Whetstone well. Again, the thick blue line, current conditions, that being much below both last year and the median conditions at this well. I didn't mention in the other one, but I just want to point out that we have this key here with the bar down below where this pertaining only to the current year, the thick blue line, but where we have provisional data and approved data, so that can always be subject to change. But yeah, and below normal conditions over there near Walla Walla. And panning out further again to look at the trends in this well, recharge, we're kind of at a lower condition, almost maybe as low as we were here in 2022. So on the lower side of groundwater at this site over the past 5 to 10 years. So just in summary here, the 7-day average stream flow at 8 index gauging stations being below normal at all of them, with the exception of Puyallup River being much below normal. Cumulative runoff hydrograph shows that we are much below normal as well. And monthly average groundwater conditions at Davenport Well being between last year and the median, and that Whetstone Well being below median and last year. And with that, yeah, thanks for your time.
Great. Thank you very much, Nick.
Thank you very much, Nick.
Mm-hmm.
Any quick questions?
Any questions?
All right, we will move to Chris. Heather, do you have Chris's slides pulled up?
I do. Getting those up right now.
Great, thank you.
Okay, can you hear me okay?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, sorry, I'm using my phone's video because mine on my laptop isn't working, so it looks kind of odd, but I guess that'll work. Okay, try something a little different here. It's a little better. Okay, so yes, you can go to the next slide. I'm using several slides. We did put out a press release in the news release for our October water supply meeting. I'll touch on that here in this presentation a little bit. Next. Just to rewind back to early September, this is a picture of the Kittitas Reclamation District's spillway 1146. And as you can see, it's the sides are collapsing. Anyway, it was not usable this year. It was a key feature in our flip-flop operation where we pass water down the KRD canal to bypass spawning reaches and release water down this chute back to the river. We were not able to use it this year, and it has made operations a bit more difficult, and we weren't able to quite use as much water out of one of our key reservoirs for flip-flop Cachis. Although KRD has worked well in really hard in trying to get water through other drops back to the river in different locations. It was more spread out, but it was very, very, very helpful. It also, yeah, you can go to the next slide. Okay, just sort of a recap on conditions at the Yakima Airport in September. Temperatures, for the most part, were ranging in the normal category, except for some early highs in September, very warm, and then some miscellaneous warm days later in the month. Just the general feeling over here was that it was a fairly warm September, and yeah, very dry. There was really essentially not much rain at the airport. Next. That does affect demand in our orchards and fields. So it had definitely influenced the demand from our reservoirs. This is a precipitation graph for the whole water year. The green line is the current year, and the black line is average. Blue is the maximum experienced, and red is the minimum. For the water year, we ended up at 83.5% of average. And I should note that this is a sum of 5 gauging stations, the 5 reservoir sites. We've been presenting this for many, many years. I do want to point out, if you go back to February, you'll see that February, March, I'm sorry, direct your attention to the top of the graph, the green percentage numbers. You'll see in the February month, it was about 76% of average. And then we had about 49% of average, 57, 79. So we had 1, 2, 3, 4 months of below average, and then one wet month, June, which doesn't have as much precip as those preceding months. And then again, dry July. We had an event in August, and then a really, really dry September. So that has affected our water supply, especially this dry September really affected our reservoir levels. Next. Okay, just a quick look at our stream flows into our reservoirs. The green line depicts the sum of the inflows into our reservoirs. You can see that at the end of September, it landed about 50% of average. And you can see that August event did perk things up a bit, and we were actually tracking close to average into September, and then we just dropped off dramatically in September. Next slide. Next slide. There we go. I think we missed one. Not sure.
Sorry about that. I can go back.
Yes, this one. Thank you. The Parker unregulated flow volume is it's very interesting because it is a computed number, but it showed much lower relative to average than our inflows at our reservoirs. And September was a record, and that was a 34% of average. So yeah, very, very dry conditions in the basin down to our Yakima River near Parker gauge. So the previous slide represented flows into the reservoirs. So those are flows up high in the mountains. But then the other tributaries that aren't regulated and other flows that come in must be extremely low. Although this is provisional and it is a computed number, so there's a lot of opportunity for being off. Next slide. Okay, this shows our diversions. They build beginning in March. Again, the green line is this year. The black line is the average. You can see we increased in March, April, May, and had an event. And then we built through the summer months. And then we typically do decline, as you can see with the average. The black line is the average, and it does typically decline beginning early August. And a number of those dips are from natural events or things happening. And it typically declines again through September, but we saw this leveling off in late September, which is reflective of the higher demands that we've had in late September this year in the dry conditions. Anyway, there was heavier usage in September than would have been expected. total usage though for March through September was 84% of average. So yeah, of course that is due to the proration rate, which I'll talk about in a minute. Next slide. Okay, the green line is this year's reservoir contents in acre feet. And you can see that, well, full is 1.06 million acre feet. You can see where the blue line is the maximum. That's pretty much where that settles out. During the summer months is full pull. You can see that we did not reach full pull, significantly below full. And then we declined, and we're tracking above the minimum, but with September, a lot of those years recovered or had some increased inflows, whereas this year things went the other way. We haven't yet received precipitation that would turn things around. I do want to say that the demand will decline significantly this weekend and stop the heavy decline at the reservoirs. We have some reservoirs at their, operational low points, and we've made a commitment to not go, for example, below 10,000 acre feet at Rimrock Reservoir, and we're approaching that. We've talked to the irrigation districts and just to see what they could do to reduce their diversions, and we've gotten really good responses from the districts to help maintain our commitments to stay above the 10,000 acre feet. Rimrock. So I just want to mention that everybody jumped on board and has helped out. But we are ending up very, very low. The latest is 85,000 acre feet. That's 29% of average, about 8% full. Next slide. Just a comparison of different years that had very low storage. We're lower than we were last year by about 20,000 acre feet on the 1st of October. And we actually were able to start recovery a bit in October because it was a little wetter. And then 2001, we were tracking above that, and we crossed that line recently. But we're still above the 90s, the 1990s and 1987, which was very low. Next slide. I do routings for Rimrock, and this just shows that we'll have very low carryover. This was, I did a couple of weeks ago, and we thought we would stay above the 10,000 acre feet, but things were just not, inflow just kept dropping off and demand just held up. So it's actually on track to stay below that red line. We'll end up below the projection we had just a couple of weeks ago. Next slide. Okay, this is the October water supply available. I'm not going to go into detail. It's just we separate out October from the rest of the water year, and we have line items for the supply and the line items for a carryover, and what's going to flow out of the basin and not be available, et cetera, et cetera. But the point that I just want to make is if you go down to where you see 0%, that's the pro-rationing rate. And if you look at the mid column, that's the adopted proposed pro-ration rate. That means that our pro-ratable irrigation districts didn't receive any new October water. And if they had any leftover from the April through September TWSA period, they were able to use it. I should say the May 21st through September 30th period, because that's the official pro-rationing period this year. Anyway, no new water. Next slide. This is a recap from May through September of our water supply. And again, let me just direct you down to the gray boxes. You can see that on May 1st, before we actually started pro-rationing, we were projecting a 54% supply. We did drop to 47% in June, and then climbed to 51%, held there through August. But then things did look positive at the beginning of September, probably, influenced by the rain we got in August, and typical, even not normal, but typical, even slight recoveries that we typically see in September. We were able to increase it to 52%, but in retrospect, the September water actually did not materialize. It just got worse. And that actually didn't reveal itself very soon in September. So we ended up sticking with the 52% through the end of September, just because most of it is allocated at that time. Next slide. And this looks ahead at our minimum in-stream flows. Well, these are mostly set except for Rimrock and Cheese. But you can see we're on the low end of our table that we set, and that is based on carryover, largely on carryover. And we also take into account what the ENSO condition is going into the winter time. If the carryover is a little better, a certain ENSO condition could boost the column we use here. Next slide. Yeah, it's a long summary. Just to recap, flip-flop had no use of spillway 1146. Did seem to decrease the amount of water realized out of our upper Catchise Reservoir. We're at the beginning of the month, we're still at about the sixth lowest storage since 1971, 84,000 acre feet right now. The latest I looked at, 8% full, 29% of average. September precip forecast. Oh yeah, I didn't mention this, but there had been numerous precipitation forecasts that just did not seem to materialize when comparing them, the actuals, to the QPFs. And we look at the amounts up there near the summit, near the crest, and coming east. So that was another thing that did affect somewhat, because we're looking at forecasts and trying to evaluate the supply. And the QPF almost always had some decent event out there in the offing, but it didn't really push over very well at all. So we had ended up with very low September precip, 25% of average. At our reservoirs, record low September Parker unregulated flow, 34% of average. Diversions and reservoir demand has been relatively high based on our progression rate and typically what happens at the end of September. the October pro-rationing rate is 0%. TWSA pro-ration rate ended at 52%. Target flows remain very low, 322 CFS. There's a conservation water that can be used for winter or spring flows. That's at about 3,000 plus 1,500 to 2,000 extra that they could accumulate in October. And Rimrock will end up very low. The other reservoirs are low as well. So it's a stressful time right now at the end of the season.
Right. Thank you for that, Chris. And thanks for emphasizing where things are with storage and what that may mean for this coming water year. And with that, we'll transition over to Amy with the Northwest River Forecast Center.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. All right. And are you seeing my slides?
Yes.
Okay, great. I don't have a lot to say today because it's the beginning of the water year. But here's everybody who serves you here in Washington on this first slide. Just to be clear, I'm from the River Forecast Center, but my colleagues at the weather field offices are all listed there below. I wanted to start out by just showing last year, although Karen covered the precipitation very well. So the seasonal precipitation for the entire water year is shown here on the left, and you can see big swaths of Washington have yellow and even orange, indicating below normal precipitation, and the whole water year runoff in terms of volume and expressed as a percent normal is shown here on the right. And you could see also a lot of yellows and oranges. I would say the runoff looks worse than the precipitation, likely because a lot of it was lack of snowpack, which tends to produce more runoff. So not a great water year. Looking at how our April through September volume forecasts turned out, on the left-hand side, we're looking at the April through September volumes in these river points, again expressed as a percent normal. So all these oranges are well below normal. Yellows are below normal as well, but not quite as bad. And then we do have some greens here poking through, indicating near normal runoff volumes. On the right-hand side, I'm showing the same information, but expressed as percentile. And it paints a more drastic picture of how low these runoff volumes were when compared to their own historic records. So all these deep reds, especially these single-digit red with the white font here, were either record low, like that one there is probably a record low, or flirting with it, so quite close to it. So yeah, not a great runoff year. All told, I'm not going to dive into how our forecasts did. As Karen noted, I will be going over that in the Oregon-Washington meeting later this month. But all over, when I poked around Washington ahead of this meeting, we were forecasting below normal water supply volumes for quite a while before this really started to be observed. So I think overall our forecast did not do too bad. We did have a little bit of a high bias during the melt-off season, which is pretty typical of our model. Jumping ahead to the 10 days of precipitation forecast, in our ESP forecasts, you can see there's a nice shot of precipitation expected to hit Western Washington in the next 10 days. I looked at the daily amounts forecast, and it looks like the vast majority of this, I think all of it actually, is forecast to hit in the last 5 days of the 10-day period. Those 5 days, we have less skill in those forecasts that are further out. So we'll see how this comes in. The same information is shown here in this middle graphic, but the oranges and yellows are indicating this is less precipitation than normal to fall in these 10 days. Same story here on the right-hand side, although this graphic, which is expressing the same information as a percent of climatology, shows a little bit of optimism here for the coastline around the Puget Sound. That's all I was going to show today. I wasn't going to show our forecasts that have just started coming out for the water year 2025 year. It's just pretty early to be looking at those. Right now they reflect the soil moisture states in our model, which are a little lower than normal coming off of this dry year. But there's a lot of water year ahead of us. You know, we have to see how the snowpack builds, how the precipitation comes in. So I held off on showing those for now. And that is all I have. Any
Great.
questions?
Thank you, Amy. Any questions for Amy? And Nick, do you see there is a question for you in the chat regarding any plans to replace the Scatter Creek well with another monitoring well for the alluvial aquifer conditions on the west side?
Oh, I didn't see that. Thanks for pointing it out.
Yeah.
Not that I know of. Oh, I had lost connection and then came back, so I don't see anything in the chat. Maybe that's why. So that well was, for one, all the wells that I have been showing are federally funded, and that funding's been cut, and we were asked to eliminate I think 2 or 3 of the wells that we had in the state, and that was chosen as one of them, but also coincided with the fact of land ownership and them the owner of the land not wanting to maintain that well as of now. So I guess, yeah, it's a matter of funding. It's always unfortunate when that's cut and we have to do away with wells or stream gauges, but that's yeah, just how it's happened.
Yeah, but that is tough for the data. But yeah, thanks for sharing some of those background pieces.
Mm-hmm.
Great. And Matt did send me a couple of slides from NRCS. Heather, can you share Matt's slides? And he sent me a couple of captions for each as well. So I'll go through those quickly, and then we'll have a few minutes for discussion too.
Just a second, I got you.
Great, thank you. And thanks, Nick, for taking the time to join us here, even if we're a little under the weather. Definitely appreciated.
Of course.
Okay.
Great. Thanks, Heather. So Matt coming in from leave, go to the next one, please. And this is an image of the Thunder Basin Snowtell Station. Very exciting that Matt wanted to share. Nearly all the site maintenance is complete in Washington, which is very exciting. And if you see here, got 2024 in the orange. So coming in kind of in the lower side of the middle, but not quite, you know, different orange than you see all the way for the lowest in terms of precipitation accumulation for the 2024 water year. Next one. I'm not going to repeat too many things other folks have said with Matt's slides, but kind of wanted to highlight some of the pieces he had here with some different visuals. This one showing the precipitation. Oh, now, sorry, the Thunder Basin was the first one. Now we've got sort of the precipitation profile showing for, oh, sorry, yeah, that was the previous one here. Yeah, so now we've got our basin and site map for water year 2024 precipitation. Deficits persisted throughout the water year for much of the Cascades, Olympics, Peninsula, Northern Blues in Oregon, and portions of the upper Columbia Basin. In terms of both snowpack and precipitation, the Cowlitz and Lewes basins were really the only shining light in the state this year. Next one. And this comparing September and what we have so far of October. Precipitation in September was mostly well below normal across the state, except for a few stations. While still early in October, precipitation is variable across the state, with generally below normal precipitation at stations east of the Cascades and below to near normal precipitation at stations across the Cascades and on the Olympic Peninsula. So similar to what we heard from Amy and Karen, definitely seeing some concerns compared to normal for September and so far in October. Next. And thinking about soil moisture, as Matt often does, soil sensors failed at Beaver Pass, unfortunately. Soil moisture conditions at the 2 stations in the North Cascades are below normal, and likewise at Bucking Horse on the peninsula and at the Burnt Mountain Station near Rainier. Next, soil moisture. And this one showing at stations in the upper Columbia Basin, soil conditions vary from slightly above normal at Gold Axe Camp to below normal at Moses Mountain. At Reagan Mountain in the Spokane Basin, soil conditions are near normal, and same for soils at Sourdough Gulch, Snowtail, and the Northern Blues. And last one here. And there's general agreement of dry soil moisture conditions in central Washington, with generally wetter soil conditions in much of Northwest and on parts of the Olympic Peninsula. So again, often with soil moisture, different stories and different products, but we are seeing some agreement here with these ones. And that is it for Matt's slides there, but always good to have some different visuals and slightly different stories as we look at things. And so with that, I am going to stop our recording